Moving away from South Africa, Zimbabwe's President Emmerson Mnangagwa has been accused of launching a brutal attack on citizens' rights to freedom of expression, peaceful assembly and association, following his decision to sign off the draconian Criminal Law Codification and Reform Amendment Bill into law, of course, just a month before the country goes to the polls. The Patriotic bill lists as an offense willfully injuring the sovereignty and national interests of Zimbabwe by citizens calling for military intervention and sanctions against the country.
The bill was widely opposed by the international community, lawyers and rights defenders, describing it as a grave assault on human rights. Amnesty International over the weekend said Mnangagwa must immediately reverse his decision, which will further silence dissent with human rights organizations, urging the government to fully and effectively respect, protect, promote, and fulfill the rights of everyone to freedom of expression, peaceful assembly, and association. We're joined this morning by the chairperson of Crisis in Zimbabwe Coalition, Peter Gift Mutasa. Good morning, and thank you very much for joining us.
Good morning, and good morning, listeners and viewers from across Africa.
All right. The Patriotic bill has garnered a lot of reactions with a number of people who are against it. Amnesty International has asked that it be reversed. Do you possibly see this happening? Do you see that the government of Emmerson Mnangagwa would pay attention and maybe potentially reverse this? If not, what does this mean for the people of Zimbabwe?
I think it would be naive for us to think that the government of President Mnangagwa will reverse this bill, because it is a government that came through a coup, and we have been witnessing since 2017 consolidation of authoritarian rule. It is a government that is so clear and aware that it has lost any semblance of ideological hegemony. It is there on the basis of military power, there on the basis of state security power. It is also a government that is aware that throughout the 5 years that they've been in power after the past election, they've lost legitimacy in terms of output legitimacy, in terms of failure to deliver public services. We go to our hospitals, there are death chambers, hospitals without equipment, without drugs, and with a demotivated public health services workforce. You go to our schools without books, without adequate teachers, and some students still learning in the sun and in the open. You go to other areas, you still find the same. The economy has been mismanaged. We've got the highest inflation rate in the country, over 1,220, according to other sources. We also have a devaluing exchange rate crisis, and workers are literally working for nothing. We have domestic workers who are still, whose minimum wage is still 10,000 local currency, which is $1 for working for a month. We have a national minimum wage, which is 25,000 local currency, which is less than $2.50. Majority of people are earning below $100 when the Consumer Council of Zimbabwe Family Basket states that the minimum that a family should earn is $443. So the government has lost legitimacy. Its only way to stay in power and to maintain power is therefore to use state security, brute state security force to remain in power. And this law is likely going to stay.
Yeah, but let's also look closer at what the law is saying and some of the things that it states. It says criminalizing any citizen caught willfully injuring Zimbabwe's sovereignty, dignity and independence as a nation, criminalizing those who participate in meetings with the intention to promote, advance, encourage, instigate or advocate sanctions or trade boycotts against the country, and of course the death penalty for those perceived to have conspired to unseat the government, including individuals acting as agents or proxies for such entities. You can't really fault, these details, can you? Will any country, allow for, citizens to call for military intervention on its country, or to call for sanctions against its own country, or to try to unseat its government? Is there any of these things that you fought, President Mnangagwa, creating laws to of course, criminalize?
So these crimes are fully and adequately provided in the criminal code already. They were fully provided for in the criminal code. Why this particular amendment, and where we have concerns as civil society and citizens, is that they brought in a law that is broadly defined, that is quite vague, that can accommodate any unknown action as a crime. So we are concerned about the vagueness, about the broadness of the new amendment. It takes a dragnet approach where citizens are not aware if my conduct is going to be regarded as a crime. In the previous criminal code, you would know that treason is a crime and it's properly defined. So this one is widely defined, and we know how state agents like the police, like prosecutors, like the judiciary have been partisan in their discharge of duty, and have been biased towards the executive. So now anyone in the state security can simply say, you attended this meeting, and this meeting was discussing, was injuring the sovereignty and the national interests of Zimbabwe. For example, what is injuring sovereignty of Zimbabwe? What is injuring the national interests of Zimbabwe? And if you look at some of the provisions, they are also very broadly defined. You don't know whether a meeting that we've been invited will discuss something about sanctions, for example. And some of the clauses are so broad that they simply seek to muzzle expression. So we should be allowed as citizens to express ourselves. We should be allowed as citizens to also associate with anyone else. But the law must be so specific that anyone would know that if I take this particular act, I am going to be committing a crime. With the current amendment, no one is sure, and it can be used to simply violate people's rights.
Absolutely. I mean, the ambiguity of this law and the multiple interpretation is subject to is a grave cause for concern. Amnesty International has said that the weaponization of this law might be used as a means to silence Zimbabweans during the upcoming elections on the 23rd of August. And I'd like you to speak to that. Talk to us about what this means for the elections that are coming up. We also like to look at what's been happening in Zimbabwe and how the opposition has alleged that the current administration, the administration of Emmerson Mnangagwa and the ZANU-PF, has tried to stifle consistently actions of the opposition, the Triple C party. So talk to us about what this means first for the incoming elections on the 23rd of August, and what this means for journalists as well, who may be potentially afraid of reporting certain stories because they do not want to be considered as, target as affecting the national interest or the national sovereignty of the people of Zimbabwe.
So the law must not be taken in isolation. We must look at this particular piece of law in a holistic manner, looking at what has been happening. As we speak today, we have political prisoners, Job Sekala, who is in prison. We have got Jacob Ngarivume, a political leader, the president of the opposition, who is also in prison. They are in prison for carrying out their duties as a lawyer, for Job Sekala, for representing a family whose member was murdered in a political motivated violence. We also have Ngarivume, who is in prison for calling for peaceful protest. So all these actions culminate into a harvest of fear for the ruling party. So the coming in of the Patriotic bill, we also have a pending bill, the Private Voluntary Organization Bill, that also seeks to muzzle dissent and also to muzzle freedom of expression and association of non-governmental organizations. We have been witnessing the banning of the opposition Triple C rallies all over the country. We also have witnessed that the police, the military have taken away citizens' constitutional rights, the right to protest, the right to demonstrate peacefully. We have the Constitution, and the constitutional rights are intact in the Constitution. But in practice, these rights have been taken away. So what will happen with this coming in of the Patriotic Bill? It will simply add on the fear that citizens already have, and journalists will be very, very careful. They don't know whether if you have an interview like I'm doing here, I'm not sure whether this interview will be regarded as willfully injuring the sovereignty of the country. People will not be able to call for meetings and to consult with maybe regional organizations like SADC, like African Union. When we face violations, human rights violations here, we used to run to SADC and to complain to SADC and seek for their intervention, to African Union, to Commonwealth. Now with this new law, it means that these violations are going to be done and we don't have anywhere to go because we are so scared. We are not sure whether this will not be part of this law whose sanction is also death or life in prison. So this is going to affect that aspect very seriously.
And I'm glad that you mentioned that, because I was going to ask you if you fear for yourself that this interview might be considered willfully affecting the sovereignty of the people of Zimbabwe. And I also wanted to ask again something that you've alluded to. Emmerson Mnangagwa is strongly against Western interference and has shown and spoken about it over and over again, especially as regards the imposition of sanctions. We also know that part of this law stipulates that anyone who says or does anything, to ensure that, they would, in fact, I'm going to quote, it says, willfully injuring the sovereignty and national interests of Zimbabwe, and those who participate in meetings with the intention of promoting calls for economic sanctions against the country. What is really the hope for the people of Zimbabwe now? What can the rest of Africa do? Is there anything at all that the rest of Africa can do to ensure that this draconian law does not take effect? What can Africa do and the world to support the people of Zimbabwe in this time? Is there anything that can be done?
Yeah, so the first thing is that we want to be very clear that there is no Zimbabwean. I, for example, and many good standing Zimbabweans that I know in the civic space, in opposition, and in many other spaces, that would want to willfully destroy their own country and to willfully call for sanctions for their own country. Why Zimbabweans speak out and why we speak out to our brothers in Africa is simply because we do not have the freedom that we fought for. When we were fighting against colonialism, we were fighting for independence, but also political and civic freedoms. And because we do not have those freedoms, our rights are violated. We only seek solidarity from our African brothers and sisters. So the first thing that we would call on African brothers and sisters and governments in Africa is that they should intervene and speak to the Zimbabwean government and seek it to understand that Zimbabweans need freedom. We need to enjoy our freedom of expression, freedom of association and assembly. And for African governments, if they do not have such a piece of law that is so vague and broad, and knowing that the police in Zimbabwe and the judiciary in Zimbabwe has been using such pieces of law that are not so clear to persecute through prosecution those who dissent and those who raise voices against the state human rights violations. We need the African Union, we need SADC to intervene and to find a way of convincing the government of Zimbabwe to make sure that it does not violate its own constitution, it does not violate the human and people's rights charter of the African Union. Right. It also does not violate the international conventions that we have, like IRCC.
Mr. Mustasa, unfortunately, we of course would have to end the conversation here. We all, will continue to closely follow the situation in Zimbabwe, and we hope that on the 23rd of August, the Zimbabwean people are able to make the best decisions, for themselves, for their country moving forward. Thank you very much for joining us, and we will be speaking with you again.
Thank you. Thank you very much.